Before we start, let me share today's agenda with you. You have just come out of your first breakout session, and now we're going to be hearing a talk from Professor Fernando Reimers, followed by an informed dialogue discussion with our panelists on today's topic, empowering students to improve the world in 60 lessons. You will then be broken up into your second breakout groups where you will have a discussion, and then we'll come back together to wrap up and have a Q&A session after that. Now, without further ado, let me invite Professor Fernando Reimers to begin this evening with his presentation.
Thank you so very much, Lou, for that kind introduction and for your leadership in bringing us together as a community to talk about how can we make the education experience more interesting for students. And I so appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with Kathleen, with Elisa, with Cheryl, and with Samuel on this panel. What I'm going to present is very simple and can be reduced to two ideas. In order to prepare our students to live the 5 values that Lou was just talking about, we should do 2 things. 1, assume that they are smart because students rise to our highest expectations for them. And 2, bring the world to the classroom. Make sure that the schools have big windows onto the world and that we make it visible for students how it is that what they learn in school relates not just to the outside world, but to big problems in the outside world. And I can think of no better way to do that than to use as a framework the UN Sustainable Development Goals that articulate an inclusive, a capacious vision of a world in which we all relate to one another in a way that is accepting, that values our differences, in a way that allows peace, and that we relate to the earth in a way that is sustainable. So over the last several years, I've been working developing curriculum materials aligned with the SDGs, doing something very simple, translating the SDGs into a framework of competencies for students that should then guide the design of empowering educational experiences that can be articulated in a continuum all the way from kindergarten to high school, so that we treat the development of global competency with the same rigor that we would treat anything that we value, whether it's teaching math, whether it's developing language, whether it's teaching chemistry. The second idea, in having done that work, which I'm going to summarize, I have realized that if we want to bring that kind of change to scale, communication is of the essence. And education reform is fundamentally an exercise in communication. But to communicate with a very large number of people, it's essential that we can put ourselves in their shoes. And it is not very productive to assume that everyone else sees the world the same way we do. And so what I've done in the book, which I'll be introducing, educating students to improve the world, is to frame 5 different ways through which people can see the world. And I do that with 2 goals. 1, to facilitate the development of empathy, to make it easier for any one of us to understand how can one of our interlocutors be seeing this process of change so we can have better communication. And secondly, to empower a more robust vision, a more complete, a multidimensional vision on the part of any one of us who's trying to produce change, in seeing change through 5 frames. So I've given you the punchline on what I'm going to say. Let me now just share a few slides, if I may, and I know I'll do that in 10 minutes. Can you all see my screen right now? All right. So I've already talked about this beautiful vision. The idea of global citizenship, by the way, is not new. In my studies, I found that it's at least 20 centuries old, and it comes down to this idea of terrence. To be human is to live so that nothing human is foreign to us. And if we could use this as the credo, as the aspiration of a global citizenship education, I think the world would be very well served. Of course, Target 4.7 of the UN SDGs spells out for us what an education to cultivate global citizens looks like, an education that empowers people to advance sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, a promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and an appreciation of cultural diversity and of the role of cultures in contributing to sustainable development. If we look at how teachers teach around the world and how students experience education around the world, we see that there is a big gap between those aspirations and the reality of schools around the world. So these are figures collected by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in the last administration of the PISA survey, where 15-year-olds were asked questions like, is there a purpose to your life? Are you happy with your life? And what we see is that a significant percentage of students are not. In Malaysia here, only 63% of the students. How come 2 in 5 students do not respond in the affirmative? Now, this may be related to what the experience in school is like. When students were asked in the same survey, have you been recently bullied in school? A very high percentage of students have been. In Malaysia, almost 40%. And so how come these wonderful institutions we call schools, which were created to empower students to build a better world, become a place in which students experience and perpetrate violence? Similarly, when students are asked, does your life have a clear meaning or purpose? What we see is that very large percentage of students at the age of 15 don't see a purpose bigger than themselves for their lives. So I think this outlines for us that we should be doing something different in our schools, that we shouldn't be spending all this effort and all this time and all these resources to just go through the motions and get students to feel unhappy, be the perpetrators or the victims of violence, and at the end of the day, not be happy with their lives or have a purpose for their lives. Other surveys from the OECD in which teachers are asked to describe how they teach basically paint the next picture. Most teachers are very good at presenting content, even doing it in a very adept way, explaining the goals of what they want to teach, connecting what they want to teach with what they've taught, but not so good at creating opportunities for students to collaborate with others in problems that have no obvious solution, in problems where they have to figure out the solution. In other words, not so good at recreating for students the very situations they're going to experience in their lives. And I think that's why this convening that Lou and her colleagues have organized is so important, because it is about reimagining what an education experience should be so that it empowers students. So I won't go through these slides. You can all look at them later, but the bottom line is that when it comes to teacher-centered teaching, most teachers are great, but when it comes to giving students challenges that have no obvious solutions, very few teachers do that. When it comes to giving students challenges that require thinking critically, very few teachers do that. When it comes to having students work for an extended period on a problem or a task, very few teachers do that. When it comes to letting the students figure out how to solve a problem, very few teachers do that. When it comes to giving students activities that require at least a week to complete, very few teachers. In other words, very few teachers do the very kinds of things that we should be doing if the goal is to equip students to solve adaptive challenges. And I think that's what these materials have done. I have developed a curriculum which is in use in thousands of schools. By the way, Lou, I'm so grateful that your foundation has taken it upon itself to translate these materials in Malay and to make them widely available in Malaysia. I'm very, very pleased to see that. So these are resources that exist essentially to provide support to teachers in figuring out how to do that. So just very quickly, what is empowering global citizens? Well, it's something that begins with a clear set of principles. Begin with the end in mind, provide a lot of project-based activities with an emphasis on doing, on active learning, focus on the development of breadth of skills with clear capstones at the end of the year where students work for an entire year in a challenging problem with units that help them see the connections across disciplines where they learn content that is new. This curriculum, which was developed 7 years ago, one of the units is public health. One of the elements is pandemics. We articulated then students will not be able to function in the 21st century if they don't understand the mechanisms through which a pandemic, for example, is spread. What is the goal? To foster agency, to help students learn from what works, to help develop an innovative and entrepreneurial spirit, to develop seamless connections between schools and communities, to promote the development of analytic and problem-solving skills, using global challenges and human rights as a focus, helping students understand the connection between global and local, engaging them with issues that are complex, messy, that have no easy answers, like how do we live in the midst of a pandemic? A curriculum, in short, that assumes kids are smart, that is age appropriate, but that is not debilitating, infantilizing, and that helps students see the connection from what is personal and immediate to more advanced and conceptual understandings. So from those principles, we then develop a profile of a graduate. And I don't have time to go through that, but I think you've all had access to the readings. We develop a series of categories within which we identify very specific operational constructs of what it is that a student should learn at the end of a high school course. And so essentially what this tool does is it makes it possible for educators to test the two core hypotheses of any education. If students learn A, the consequences for themselves or their communities or their societies will be B. And in order for students to learn A, we must engage them in activities X, Y, and Z. And most educators are aware that this is what they do when they teach, but it's only the most thoughtful, the most reflective educators who actually formally test these hypotheses. And even then, they do it in the privacy of their own heads. They don't do it publicly in a way that makes it possible for the results of their experiments, of their pedagogical experiments, to become shared knowledge, professional knowledge that feeds back into the profession of education. Now, I realize that this curriculum, this proposal is a little bit ambitious for teachers who have not been engaged in this kind of work. So I've developed a simpler prototype, which is this book that will soon be available, that I think you all have received on PDF. And what this prototype does is it presents the very same ideas, a protocol to design and adapt a global citizenship curriculum, starting with the SDGs, a protocol to develop a school-wide strategy for global education, and finally, an example, 5 lessons per grade that illustrate how do you actually do that. So what is this process of school-wide change? Well, it's basically one that doesn't take for granted the conditions in a school to make it possible to teach these, but that actually creates that. It's basically a change management strategy for the school level that says someone has to be in charge, that someone needs to study the SDGs and think hard about what are the implications of that for the kind of knowledge and competencies that students should have. And when you're intentional and deliberate and explicit in naming those competencies, then you can look at what you do and say, where are the strengths and where are the opportunities? Then you can design the next step, a prototype for a change that is challenging, but not so challenging that it feels impossible to achieve. And then again, communicate, then make a decision and figure out how you're going to execute, identify what resources do you need, develop a simple dashboard that can help you keep track of what you're doing, again, communicate, make sure that you build the opportunities for teachers to gain the capacities to teach that, actually execute, and then evaluate and do it better the next year. And what I have just defined in this process is a simple process of continuous improvement, except that in making visible the tools, the language, the protocols that make it possible to test these two core hypotheses, I now have made it possible for schools to collaborate in a network. And an improvement network is a very robust idea because it allows every unit, every member of that network to gain not only from their own direct experience, but from the experience of others in the network. So if 6 schools were to collaborate in doing what I have just proposed, each one of them would gain in 1 year, 6 years of experience. And in that way, accelerate exponentially the velocity of change. And my hope is that what this meeting is doing and what Lou and her colleagues are doing is to bring together this network and to make it possible together for all of you to become the force for innovation that can augment the capacity to transform the entire education system in Malaysia. So lastly, onto the need to see the world with 5 eyes. You can all download on this link a free copy of this book. It's a very simple idea. The idea is if you see the world with 1 eye, you see certain things, you miss others. If you see the world with 5 eyes, you see a lot more depth. And what the book does is to explain what are these eyes. And these eyes are cultural, psychological, professional, institutional, and political. My invitation to you is that you familiarize yourself with those perspectives. And anytime you design a change process, you ask, if I were to look at this from a cultural lens, what would I need to do? If I were to look at it from a psychological perspective, what should I do? If I were to look at this through a professional, and so on and so forth. And so that capacious multidimensional vision is what would make it possible to transform, to take the focus of global education from the classroom and the solo work of a teacher to expand it to the entire school and the entire system, which I think is what we need to do in a hurry if we are going to address the looming challenges that we face. And so what's the cultural perspective? Understand that a school is embedded in a larger social system that involves other institutions, families, religious institutions, social organizations, community organizations, and there needs to be seamless communication between those two. What's the psychological perspective? relying on and deploying the science of learning to design the best experiences, the most empowering experiences. What's a professional perspective? Creating the opportunities for people to become increasingly better, more expert at what they do. What's an institutional perspective? Understanding that an education system is a set of interlocking components, all of which need to be coherently aligned and in communication with one another. We do very little in changing a curriculum if we don't change the assessment, if we don't change the instructional materials, if we don't similarly change the way in which we prepare teachers. And lastly, what's a political perspective? Understanding that each and every one of us has a view of a world that is worth living, of the world we're trying to build. And those views are absolutely legitimate. It's in the interest of any reform that aspires to be sustainable, to create the opportunities for us to bring our values, our heart with us, and to talk about those visions so that we build a reform that is a big tent where we can all belong and we can provide the necessary support for this collective leadership over the long haul. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Professor Fernando, for such an insightful presentation. I think just in that 15 minutes, you packed in so much for us to think about. And I really love what you said about designing a curriculum that assumes that kids are smart. And that's, yeah, I just really love that. Let's now dive deeper into this topic with the rest of our panelists. So I'm going to invite Elisa, Dr. Kathleen, Samuel, and Cheryl into this conversation. Good evening or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. And let's just start talking about the book and the concepts that Professor Fernando Reimers has just introduced. Today, we're talking about the importance of global education and empowering students to improve the world. In the book that we just heard about, well, we heard about two books, but in the first book that we spoke about, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, there are 60 lesson plans from year 1 to year 12 that offers teachers a way of integrating the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals into the curriculum. What are your views on this curriculum? I know you've all read the book. And maybe, Elisa, we can start with you because you have actually used these lessons and you've actually adapted them in Spanish and actually used them in your school. And I think you even have a book on lessons that has come out of this. So maybe you can start and tell us what you think about the curriculum, and then we can just continue from there.
Sure, of course, Lou. I'm happy to do that. And hi, everyone. Good morning. It's very early here in Mexico, and I am very excited to be with fellow teachers from Malaysia and other parts in the world. Well, yes, as Lou said, I have had the opportunity to work with the book. In fact, when Empowering Students to Change the World in 60 Lessons was about to be published, Professor Reimers asked me if I would be willing to write a blurb for it. And I just jumped at the opportunity to get my hands on the manuscript. And by mere coincidence, I was working myself on a series of language and literacy textbooks for elementary school children. And I had the goal of incorporating global citizenship into that curriculum. So when I read Professor Reimers' book, I realized that he had already done the hard work of creating a repository of lessons that could be easily applied. And so I asked him if I could adapt some of those lessons to be included in my textbooks. And he immediately agreed. And I need to say this, Professor Reimers is probably not only the most prolific living writer I know. I mean, it's hard to keep up with him. As soon as you finish reading one book, he already has another one to offer. But he's not only prolific, he's also very, very generous with his work. So I worked on his book to adapt many of the lessons into our context. This was a series of books for 1st to 6th graders, elementary school. And of course, in Spanish, to be used in Mexico and Latin America. And now every year, about 50,000 students learn using these materials. So I am very, very happy. And they are, of course, not only better readers, which was the principal goal of the textbooks. They are language and literacy textbooks, but because global citizenship is embedded into that curriculum, they are also getting better at becoming global global citizens by using these materials. And of course, we have been using them in our school and network of schools. So in order to do that, we did the 13 steps, which is also a wonderful protocol, not only to improve your school in the global citizenship sense, but for anything that you can change and that you want to bring into the school is a protocol that can be reapplied for other aspects of the schoolwork as well, not just global citizenship. But we use it for global citizenship. We also developed a training course for our teachers. Because of course, if you're going to be teaching students about becoming global citizens, we also should be working in becoming global citizens ourselves. And there are a lot of assumptions that we do not realize until we get this wonderful work started. So it's been a wonderful experience.
Great. Oh, that's so good to know. And yeah, I think that the interesting thing there is how can we adapt that curriculum, which I think Professor Reimers said is actually a prototype into your context. And I think you've done that so well, and offered that in Spanish to people in Latin America. I suppose to the rest of the panelists, Samuel, you're an educator. Cheryl, you work with school leaders, and Dad and Kathleen, you work you across the board. You actually help NGOs, schools. What do you guys think about the curriculum, and especially in the Malaysian context? How do you see the curriculum working?
Well, maybe I'll jump in. So, when I first started reading the book, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is a really lofty goal, right? These SDGs, which us adults kind of struggle with a bit, and say, how are we going to apply that in our workplace and in what we do? And the 60 lessons we're going to teach kids from primary 1, right up to year 12. And I thought, well, maybe kids can understand poverty, say, 6 years old, I think you can understand poverty, hunger. But I struggle to understand how you could teach children that young about justice and inequality. And, one of the things as working in an education foundation, I have struggled with over the years is how do you teach children to have values? We all know that at home, parents, provide that support to kids, to have values. But not all children are so fortunate to live in a situation where the parents pay so much attention to them. So how can the school step in, right? I mean, this concept of character education and values. And the school that I was in, I was really lucky. I was in a convent school. We had nuns who were really just dedicated, and they modeled some of these values to us, and we got it. But if you don't have that, so how could that happen? And then I started looking through the 60 lessons, and especially because I was so curious about year 1, right? How do you teach this to 6-year-olds? Is it 6-year-olds, grade 1, or is it 5? Okay, 6-year-olds. And then I found that it was absolutely just so right. I love the fact that the lesson started, I think lesson 1 is with the child, it's centered on the child, and to get the child to explore himself. And if they could understand, the child can understand himself, then there's a chance that that child can try to understand his classmate, and then try to understand his community. And so, I just thought it was just, it just opened my eyes as to how you can make these very lofty concepts into something simple that a child can really understand and, get into his everyday life. And then this idea of community, I think most children live in a bubble, especially when they're small, right? And you kind of have the rich kids in their rich bubbles, the underprivileged kids in their bubbles, and they never come out of it. And yet here we are telling the kids, think about it. Think about people outside your community and what their needs are. And, this is really, I feel, a great way to just start very locally. I mean, it doesn't have to be lofty. It is just in your neighborhood, and just encouraging the kids, as Professor Reimers has just said, to have windows to the world. And I think that that's something that everyone can do.
Yeah, thanks, Tatin, for sharing that. I think I really resonated that when I was looking through the lessons, I reflected upon my time when I was teaching my students, and I was always thinking about how can they understand the communities and how can they work within the kampong that I was teaching in. And I think looking back at these lessons, I was like, why didn't I discover this earlier? But now I'm so glad I have this opportunity to share it with the school leaders that we work with. I think especially now that we are in a pandemic, we are starting to question what are we teaching in our curriculum? What is the outcome for education? And what do we want our children to become? And we're looking at the syllabus. We know in Malaysia, we have this overcrowded curriculum, right? We have so many things put into the curriculum. And when I looked at this book and when I looked at the lessons, I thought, well, this is it. This is the outcome that we want from education. And we can find a way to integrate maths and all the other things into this. But what do we want from a child is this, right? And I have 2 children, and this is what I want them to be, right? And I think just reading through it, I was really inspired, and I'm so excited. We're going to share it with our school leaders and see if they can implement it. Although I know working in the Malaysian education system is a very centralized system, means everything comes as a directive from the government, from the federal government. But then looking at the way the lessons are, it actually can be broken down into teachers implementing it in their classrooms. I saw one of the teachers said they integrated it in their English curriculum, so teachers can implement it, and then even parents can look at it and see what can they then take it to teach their children. So I think we can find a way to work with the lessons even within the constraints of our centralized education system.
Yeah, if I may, I'd like to add on to what Cheryl has just said. I think on the book and what Professor was actually sharing earlier, he emphasized a lot on the word communication. And though we like to speak a lot, I think one of the main aspects that I did, and a lot of teachers don't do as well, is not to listen. And I think we should be encouraging that as well, to listen to the community, to listen to the voices of the kids and to teachers as well. And I felt that when I was reading this book, it encouraged me to reconsider what I thought about what teaching was and how that process of teaching is supposed to happen. And I think if a book could challenge a teacher to do that, it is very likely that that book actually was done with teachers and not done for teachers. And I had that sense when I was looking through those 60 lessons, that it recognizes elements that teachers see in the classroom, issues that I think in one part of the book, you saw that there was a need to create lesson plans instead of just creating units for teachers to cover, because you reconsidered that there are aspects of classroom aspects that only teachers would know, and that's what I felt. And I also saw that you used data and evidence very differently. It was not just for ranking schools or looking for different systems ranking against one another, but it looked at how instructional practices and processes in the classrooms and schools could actually work as well. And lastly, I think that the book actually encouraged me to see that there are differences. There are differences in different contexts across the world, in different classrooms, even in Malaysia as well. But through communication, through collaboration, these are polarities that can be bridged. So it ended on a very positive note for me.
Great. And I think moving on from that, besides the lesson, that the book also provides a 13-step framework. And that framework is designed to guide a school to improve the school improvement process to advance global citizenship education. So there's 15 steps in kind of the change management that needs to, or the work that needs to happen in the school. What are your views on this 13-step framework? And I think we've just put the framework up to so that you can refer to it.
If I could maybe get started and explain why I felt the need to write that. I felt the need to write that because even though this book was widely popular at the beginning, first year, 20,000 copies of this book sold out, I began to hear from people who were trying to use it as they told me, listen, you propose here that we create a subject called the world course, and we devote to it 8 to 10 hours a week, every week from kindergarten to high school. And that this subject engages our students in active learning, interdisciplinary learning, but I cannot do that in my school. And another person said, you propose here that we need to have collaboration across teachers in doing that, but how do I produce that? So I began to assist teachers and schools and networks in trying to troubleshoot these problems. And then I realized, well, why don't I take all these answers that I've given and I translate them into a protocol? So that's where the 13 steps comes in. It basically was a response to what was missing in the first book. If I had to summarize my way of thinking at the time I wrote that, I thought, if you change curriculum, you will change the world, literally. And then I realized, well, curriculum is not self-executing. If you actually want to make it possible for curriculum to change, you have to change the school. You have to change the culture. You have to build the capacities of the teachers. And that's what the 13 steps are about. I'll stop now.
Exactly. Thank you, Professor Reimers. I think that what I like most about this book is that, of course, it provides the replicable lessons for teachers to take advantage, because I believe that many teachers around the world already know or are increasingly becoming aware of the importance of global citizenship in education. But the reality is that we are already too busy with everything else to think about crafting the lessons ourselves and embedding it into our existing curriculums. And here we have this treasure gift developed no less than by a world-leading expert on the subject. But secondly, the book also provides a structure for the school, a framework that embraces and nurtures and supports this curriculum, the global citizenship curriculum, because in global citizenship, as we said before, is not just about presenting specific lessons in the classroom. Of course, that's a very important ingredient, but it's not the only one. It is most importantly a culture, I believe, a culture that embeds itself in the environment of schools. And that book allows to do just that.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at it, you know, the 13 steps, it's almost too logical, right? It's almost like, why didn't I think of that? It's simple. It's like, you know, get your leadership team together, get them to buy in, you know, let them sit down and review what's happening, you know, bring other people in, communicate, reiterate, experiment, prototype, and all the things that actually we should be doing, you know, in whatever fields that we're in. So whilst, yeah, I just appreciate the logic of it, I can also see from the lens of the schools and the teachers looking at it and saying, but I already have this huge amount of things that in Malaysia it's very centralized, that the ministry has asked me to do. I've got to clear all this, I've got to make all these reports, and then you want me to start this process. So I think that the danger for me of this plan, while it's wonderful, is that people just look at it and say it's just too much. So, I mean, the other thing that, on the other hand, I feel is quite attractive is that if you have the lessons themselves are already prepackaged. And if someone looks at the lesson and says, oh, I can do that, you know, but I think, Professor, you say in your book that, you know, if you just do that, you might not be able to sustain the success of the program, because I think, as Elisa says, it doesn't become part of the culture. So I think there must be a strategy of both kind of enabling teachers to just start experimenting with the lesson plans. And then, you know, as they feel more comfortable with it, you know, start that process of transformation. And I totally agree with you. If schools can go through that 13 steps, they're not just going to transform global citizenship education. They're going to transform their school in every aspect. I mean, if you have to look critically at your curriculum and say, am I delivering it? You know, how am I delivering it together with these aspirations of building a globally competent child. If you can look at it with that lens, you can look at it, with all the other lenses that you need to, look at as a school leader. So, yeah, I think it's wonderful. It's ambitious, but how do we handhold the schools in order to take the first baby step? I think that's my question.
It's a great question. If I could speak to that, I totally agree with you, Kathleen, that the success of global citizenship education is not in creating a new silo, not in adding things onto the school, but in making this exercise of thinking about how to prepare students to be global citizenship as an opportunity to revisit what is done, and as an opportunity to help people think with clarity about what is it that we're trying to do here, and to look at everything that they do. And what I've tried to do with the 13 steps is to offer a process that is simple, that is actually doable. I mean, I know it has been executed in thousands of schools around the world precisely because it's simple. I have found of no more powerful way to get people to collaborate in organizations and to achieve results than to help people to think clearly about purpose. There are so many organizations that I have come to know where people forget the basic questions of what is it that we're trying to do? And how is it that we think we're doing that? And how does that align with our day-to-day? So there is, in the end, a disconnect between the real purpose of the organization and the way in which people spend most of our time. And if you can engage people, I mean, the process that I outlined here is one where a school, in devoting 1 hour a week over a period of time, they can do this. And that hour is about, first, well, let's think about these goals and what they could mean for our students need to do. Let's then translate these goals into what they should learn. Let's then, instead of thinking about bringing anything new, let's look at what we're doing already. And what is it that what we're doing is already aligned with that? Then let's think about what next. And as Elisa said, in thinking about what's next, let's not build a spaceship. Let's begin looking at these simple lessons and saying, can we adapt them? And then maybe the next step for most schools is, what's the 6th lesson that we could write together? And any group of teachers can, in a very short period of time, write one lesson. And if they've seen these 5, they can do that. I have taken groups of teachers in various parts of the world through this process of studying these 5 lessons, then writing one more. And little by little, as you get through this process, you realize that the process builds this capacity to work together in ways that sometimes people had not experienced before. The feedback I get from those some teachers is, this process helped me remember why I came into education. It taught me to collaborate with my colleagues in ways I had not been able to do before. So I'm totally with you. I think it's very important. I wouldn't call it hand-holding the schools. I would say creating a process that has been designed and that has proven successful in actually helping people remember why they joined this profession in the first place, and in teaching them to trust their colleagues and showing them what they can achieve in collaboration with their colleagues. So I really think this process as a process, ultimately, that is depending on the professionalism of teachers, and that is designed to bring out this professionalism.
Definitely, Prof. I think for me, in the work that we do with school leaders, I've been thinking a lot about the step number 2, which is developing that long-term vision. I think in the work that we do with our school leaders, we always get them to reflect, to look back at the vision of their school and what are the outcomes that they want from their students. And very often when we get them to do this exercise, it is then that they realize that, oh, all this while we've been going through day by day without actually questioning, why are the kids coming to school? What do we want from our students, and what do we want them to achieve? So I think that second point, that developing that long-term vision, is something, and perhaps also, I mean, just thinking about our work in school leaders, I think it will be ideal for them if we could break it down into small parts that they can execute in their school. So for example, if we take step number 1 and step number 2 and we do it first, and then once they've done that, like you said, Prof, 1 week with just 1 hour, they dedicate to do it. And then at the end, in a few months' time, they will develop something very comprehensive. And in that process, I think there will be a lot of reflection, a lot of time to step back and really question and to look at the outcomes that they want from their school. So I think like I'm quite excited. I see my team here as well. So quite excited to try this out with our school leaders and see how it goes. So yeah, Samuel?
Yeah, I've got a question, Professor. I mean, it seems to me that the success of, I mean, if in most policies, but especially in what you're proposing, it's highly dependent on what teachers, what schools, what systems believe constitutes as learning, as teaching and learning. And if there's a misalignment between these two expectations, at the end of the day, you have proponents saying this, proponents will be saying GCE is the best thing to do. We need to create a good world. And opponents will say, no, the best thing to do is achieve something else. So how do we bridge that gap of differences? I know it takes, in my opinion, probably it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of engagement. It takes lots of listening. But what would be the first step? I mean, especially in a Malaysian system, like I think a few of the panelists have mentioned already, this top-down thing is very real. A lot of us don't really want to do anything without being told. We don't want to be reflective of our practice. We don't want to be reflective of our interventions in schools without somebody saying you're doing it wrong. So how do you bridge that? I think the polarity is huge, but how do we bridge that?
It's a great question, Samuel. I'm an educator, so of course I fundamentally believe that we're all capable of learning and of re-examining our assumptions. And I think we're more likely to do that as a result of experience than as a result of having someone telling us that we should try something new. And that's why the focus of my work has been in constructing processes that would help teachers have those experiences, that would help them see something different. So let me give you 2 examples in answer to your question. Some years ago, I got a call from someone in Italy who had seen the 60 lesson book. And he said, this is exactly what we need. We need to produce different teachers. Can we just translate this book? Would you give us permission? I said, absolutely. You can do it just like I did with Lou, just translate it and go ahead and do it. But I did say, you really shouldn't think of the work as having been finished when you translate the book. Your translation of the book should only be version 1.0 of a process, because the real change is going to come when you work with a group of teachers who take that version 1.0, make it their own, adapt it, and then develop a version 2.0, which is theirs. And then even the version 2.0 is not the most important outcome. The most important outcome is the process, is the way in which these people would have learn to work together and to understand education. So we did that. This person was involved with a network of about 100 teachers in Italy, and they all very enthusiastically translated the book. And at the beginning, they thought they were just going to teach my lessons. But of course, I said, well, now that you have translated it, you should teach them and you should talk to each other about what did you learn. And they did that. And I said, well, now you probably have seen what's missing. Why don't you design 1 more lesson? And they actually ended up designing 3 more per grade. And the end of that process, a 1-year process, is that you now have these 100 teachers in Italy that are a model for other educators of what being a teacher could really be like, which is to being a professional that is actually creating the knowledge that guides your practice. And what they had learned was that in collaborating with colleagues, 100 colleagues, imagine most teachers never have the experience of what it means to produce something with 100 colleagues outside their schools. I did the same thing in the US. One of our main teacher unions came to me and said, we're really interested in this question. Would you work with us? Would you work with our teachers? And I said, yeah, give me, I think it was 50 teachers a year, but give me 50 teachers from every state in the United States. And we brought them together at one meeting, just like this meeting, present to them the ideas. And then I said, now you're going to develop your curriculum. And they went ahead and did it. They over a year. And the feedback I got was, I didn't realize I could be collaborating with colleagues from these very different states. These teachers really knew very little about their colleagues in other places. And they discovered that with the means we have available today in technology, it is possible in a very short period of time to do things with peers all around the place. Now, I think that this pandemic has given us, I mean, it's a tragedy, all right? I'm not celebrating this pandemic in any way. It's a calamity that has produced a lot of loss, a lot of pain, but it has also given us some opportunities. And one of them is that in trying to figure out how to teach during this very difficult time, Teachers have been in communication with their colleagues inside the schools and across schools in unprecedented ways. I think for many teachers, this pandemic has provided them an opportunity for the first time in their careers to be in conversation with colleagues in other countries. Really a remarkable opportunity for global collaboration, a remarkable opportunity for teachers to discover what they share in common with peers across other places. And I think if we build on that dividend, I think that teachers are ready. They now know that they share interest in common with peers in other places. Teachers are ready for that process. So the answer to your question, Sam, is trust the teachers. I fundamentally trust the teachers, that teachers are, like any of us, learners. What we need to create are processes and structures that make it possible to bring out the best of them. I think that teachers, like students, rise to our highest expectations and to our lowest expectations for them. If we believe our students are dumb, they will become dumb. They will not disappoint us. If we believe that teachers are incapable of agency and we build structures that basically assume the only thing they can do is whatever we hold them through the nose, that's what they will do. But I think that that's why I wrote this book, The 5 Frames, because I said we need to transform the culture of education. We need to build schools that learn. And I don't have time, that's a topic for another talk, but I do think that we need to build intelligent schools and systems. We need to build systems that have the capacity to learn. And I hope that what I'm offering today in these 13 steps is the first step in a process into turning schools into organizations that actually can learn. And an organization that learns is one that fundamentally believes in the capacity of its members to learn. And it's not easy. I mean, we may all say we believe that, but we may act in ways that belie the beliefs. And I think that as we engage in experiences that show us what is possible, then we can change our mind.
Samuel, and if I can speak to you, teacher to teacher, and to all the teachers that are with us today, I think that we don't have to ask for permission to be bold and to take agency. Forgive me if this is very controversial or not. I may make this very bold proposition that we just go ahead and do it. Mexico's education system is very centralized, very top-down, just as you were describing. And if we have to wait for them to allow us to integrate these new things into our teaching practices, we will still be waiting. So we just did it. And of course, it does not interfere with your regular curriculum. It requires some work, but we could embed it easily with some work into the curriculum. And that's what we're doing right now. And that's what teachers do. We are professionals who are capable of agency, just as Professor Reimers is assuming that students are bright, which of course is something that we teachers do. We are also assuming that we ourselves as teachers are also bright and are capable of doing this.
I totally agree with you, Alyssa and Professor. I think the reason why I asked that question, not because I believed in those stigmas. I definitely believe what you guys are saying, but a lot of other teachers are believing like that. And I like what Professor said about empowerment, and at the end of the day creates trust. And eventually that creates sustainability. Without these 3 elements, it's just, a waste of time. Sorry, Professor, for cutting you short. Yeah.
And understand that it's a journey, right? I mean, what I have seen is that in every system, people are in different stages of their development. This happens in every classroom with your students. It happens in a system, and that's fine. Understand that, it's a developmental process. And so you look for bright spots, you look for points of entry. You understand that you don't transform a system overnight. And so you need to have a sense of what does a sequence look like? What does a trajectory for a system look like? And then use that to inform your strategy. And what I have learned is that it's more productive to transform a system if you identify existing strengths and bright spots and put the light on those spots and you build on that, than if you focus on the deficiencies. I find too often that there are individuals that are obsessed with the pathology. And if all you do is talk about the pathology, you end up creating a world that is sick. And so, for example, over the last year during the pandemic, I've been doing a lot of work that I had hoped would be helpful to people trying to figure out a path forward. And at some point early on, I realized I couldn't just talk about all the problems that this pandemic is creating, which are many on education, but I had to start looking at the people who were doing good things and just put a spotlight on them. And there's something amazing that happens when you look at goodness in the world. It grows that goodness, and it's contagious. It gives people hope. It gives people hope not in the basis of selling them a fantasy, but in basis of showing them, look, this is possible. So I don't know how many of the 100 people who are with us today are going to have the courage to try the kinds of things that you and Elisa and Cheryl and Kathleen are saying should be tried. Maybe it's only 5. That's fine. And so I'm hoping that Lou would work with those 5, that she would shine a bright light on them. And these will inspire the next 5 and the next 5 and the next 5.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Professor Reimers and everyone else. I think I just love that perspective of shining that bright light and giving hope. That's so much what the world needs right now, and especially in this age of the pandemic. And, you know, people just need hope. People need to look forward to, and I think that's the basis even of our conference, that we're wanting to have the conversation on how can we rebuild better? What can we do? And if it starts from even if it starts from each and every one of us doing something, we'll get a lot further than just sort of sitting behind and thinking, oh my goodness, what can I do? Because it's so overwhelming. So thank you so much. We are, I think we could just continue this conversation further because it's just so interesting. However, it is 9:30 and we'd like to give the participants a chance in their small groups to also have a conversation and unpack this topic for themselves. So can we all give a thumbs up or a clap or a heart to our panelists and thank them for this wonderful conversation so far? And before we end the segment, I think Professor Fernando already alluded to this, but Dr. Kathleen, I think you'd like to share something with us.
Yes, I think Professor has already kind of given it away a little bit, but I'm so pleased to just launch, I think, the Professor's book, Empowering Students to Improve the World in 60 Lessons, will be translated into Bahasa Malaysia, and we will have that available to you hopefully by the end of this month. And a few months later, we would also have Educating Students to Improve the World in Bahasa Malaysia and available. So yeah, we're just so pleased that we have been able to do that. And thank you so much, Professor, for giving us that permission to translate it into our language.
Oh, you shouldn't thank me. I should thank you for your leadership and for the opportunity and for your trust in the capacity of Malays teachers to actually build a renaissance in the middle of this very difficult time. That can actually empower all of your students to build a better world. So thank you, Kathleen, for your leadership. Thank you, Lou, for your own leadership. Thank you so much, Elisa, Cheryl, and Samuel. It's been such a privilege and an honor to be in conversation with you. And thank you for what you all do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor. And yeah, so I think we're not done with, we will be back after the breakout session. So stay tuned. We'll have a summary session and a Q&A session at the end. But I think it's time now to break out into the small groups. So I think our team is ready to break you out and we'll see you back in about 40 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, from your groups. I know you're now trickling in. I hope you had a really great conversation, and Cheryl is going to take us through this next section and just summarize, and then Professor Fernando Reimers will give his closing remarks. We have about 20 minutes left, so yeah, and we aim to end on time today. Cheryl, over to you.
Thank you, Lou. I'm sure everyone had great discussions. Just looking at the Padlet, I was so excited to just get a gist of what you guys were talking about in your rooms. So what I'll do is I will try to summarize. I'll try to pull out some of the interesting points that we see here, and then hopefully, Prof, you can comment on this, or maybe just provide us with some answers if there were any questions. Okay, so I want to pull out like one of the things that I really liked. In group 27 and 28, you said that it sounds like huge, scary concepts when we say global citizenship and sustainable goals. But when we look closer, it's actually doing something small, like teaching the kids that there's a world outside their village, and which might not sound like much, but that's the first step. So I think this really summarizes a lot on what the first question was and how do you see this being implemented in your school. I think again, going to group 29, if you look at this one, it says we tend to follow a set syllabus, but as educators, we can start thinking about implementing in a small way within our lessons. And this is exactly going back to our panel just now when we were talking about what are some of the best ways, what are the first steps that we can do is as educators implementing it in our lessons. I also want to have a mix of opinions. So I want to bring you to this first one. In group 1 and 2, Joyce said, might be easier, less painful for individual teachers to execute instead of engaging on school leadership and management. And there is also one on saying, although our system is very much top down, it's a good thing that our national education philosophy is aligned with the SDGs in different ways. And also, there is one, I think my school will support this. I think if we don't ask our schools if they want to support it, we will never know. So I like Nadia from Group 4, very optimistic. I like that you put it out there that you think your school will support this. There is one more that I wanted to this again. As a teacher, we will have to start small steps like implementing it first in school, which is very important, I think. And then we need to create a space for all teachers to create a vision together. It is not easy to influence other teachers to make a change, though Prof has mentioned that to believe in teachers, that we have to believe that teachers want to change. All right, okay. So I also like this. Aisha brought up locus of control. So knowing where you are teaching, or what is your limitations, what is your school like, what is your management like. I think a lot of people brought this up, and just understanding your locus of control within what you can operate within. And she said she wants to focus on adapting the lesson plans into her lesson as she's teaching in kindergarten. This could be a powerful tool for school communities to realize the role of each sector in achievement of holistic and functional learning. All right, so going to the last one here. Incorporating this as early as possible is the best way to gain momentum in this type of education. Yeah, that's definitely true. Okay, this one. Lost in translation. Centralized policies could be reverted into KPIs to be hit. Again, I think, Prof, like I mentioned just now, there's a lot of issues, there's a lot of things being raised up about the centralized or the top-down approach in Malaysia, but I'm also seeing a lot of optimism within our teachers and really wanting to find best ways to make this work. So, Prof, over to you, Prof. Just looking at all these things, what are your initial reactions?
Well, my initial reaction is that these are wonderful questions, and I'm delighted to see so many of you seriously engaging with the idea that you would like to do this in your schools, and then imagining where, what's the point of entry, where to begin, what are the likely obstacles you're going to have to address. I completely agree with those of you who said, this is about doing something small. This is about taking baby steps at the beginning. Absolutely. I think this is true for students. This is about designing some small things that you can do that begin with students are. And so sometimes when people think about the SDGs, they think it's about teaching your kids about kids in faraway places in the world. Well, eventually it's about that, but it begins where they are. So for example, in the world course, I believe one of the very first lessons in one grade was about students engaging in an activity about what games they enjoyed, and then interviewing their grandparents about the games they enjoyed when they were little, and then bringing that information and comparing across generations, across kids, and then only eventually being in conversation with kids in a different schools around the same issue, the games they enjoyed. So I agree that this is about beginning where students are, beginning with their experiences, beginning with the things that they know, beginning with their communities, and then gradually taking them from there to more advanced, more complex understandings. I also think this is true for teachers. It's about beginning where you are. That's why one of the steps of the 13 steps is after you spend some time wrapping your head around these SDGs and what you hope your students will learn, the next step is look at what you're doing already. Because my sense is that it's quite possible that most of schools are already doing things that are completely aligned with the SDGs. So build on that, recognize those, shine a bright light on those things, and then make them better, grow from there. Some of you said begin as early as possible. Yeah, begin as early as possible so you can engage your students for as long as possible. I don't think it's a very effective way to do global education, to sprinkle some content here and there without any rhyme or reason or coherence. What I think we eventually should aspire to is a rigorous curriculum that engages students throughout their entire education trajectories in activities, day in and day out, so that eventually they build the agency, they build the self-efficacy, they build the confidence, they build the capacity to work with others. And this is not done overnight, just like learning how to read is not done overnight, just like learning math is not done overnight. So for that reason too, one of you said, well, this is easier for individual teachers to do than for entire schools to do. Yes, I recognize that. But I do think that if we leave these experiences in the classroom to the lonely efforts of a teacher, they will not translate into a coherent, continuous, and rigorous trajectory for their students. So to some extent, that is already happening. Some students are lucky enough to meet a wonderful teacher from time to time and to have some good experiences here and there. That doesn't produce the kind of preparation that having a daily opportunity to engage with those experiences produce. And the only way to produce that daily opportunity is for that teacher to be in conversation with her colleagues across subjects and across grades. And I realize this is bigger than what you could do within your classroom, and that is going to take some effort, but I also know it's possible. It's possible to do that. It's possible to engage your school because really these goals are in alignment with at least the aspirations of your schools, with the aspirations of your nation. In many ways, you're helping close the gap between aspirations and reality. I suspect if you take the time to look at your national curriculum, to look at your national standards, they all want to produce Malaysian kids who are capable of inventing products, services, who have agency, who have the capacity to be creative, who know science. And I suspect that if you were to have an honest conversation with many educators, they would recognize that there's a big gap between that aspiration and reality. So what I'm proposing is not something that is at odds with your aspirations. It's fully aligned. It's just making it possible to close that gap between rhetoric and practice. But I realize this may not be easy in some schools. Maybe the ways in which some schools have gotten to function are ways where those in formal positions of authority are expected to pretend that they are in charge, that only good ideas only come from them. And that's fine. I mean, everybody is a product of their circumstances. It is going to take an experience that things can be done in a different way for those who have those mindsets to recognize that actually good ideas can come from anywhere, and that it is a good leader, the person who creates a context that makes it possible for good ideas to come from anywhere and to be celebrated and to be built upon. And that collaboration is a better avenue to producing schools that learn, than this top-down management where those in formal positions pretend that they are in charge. It really is a pretense more than a reality in terms of the connection between that stance and what actually happens in the minds of the kids. And if we insist too much on that pretense, we end up losing the kids because a lot of kids are smart. And at some point, they discover that in such a system, what's happening in the school has no relevance to their lives. And they begin to live lives that are increasingly disassociated from what happens in the school. They begin to see the work of the school as just a game where they go through the motions, but their heart is somewhere else. And I think this is about recovering a school where it's possible for all of us to bring our hearts into the school, to actually make the work of the school meaningful. So I know that what I'm saying doesn't sound easy, but I guess what I'm saying is that I've seen change happen everywhere. That you have to have confidence, you have to have faith in your colleagues and in the capacity of your colleagues to learn new ways, to learn different ways. Now, I realize that it is always helpful to know that you're not doing that work alone, to be in community. And yeah, maybe there is power in this network that you're building right now. Maybe there's no one who can stop you from connecting with colleagues across schools and from saying, I want to share lessons with you. I want to learn from you. And you don't need to get permission. I mean, I think that there are a number of risks that we can all try to take. And so one of them is don't sit there waiting for someone to come and solve your problems. Take a step. And then I think people eventually respect those who have the courage to put themselves outside their comfort zones, to do something daring, to do something that involves some risk. Even if you don't succeed, it's fine. So I guess that's my advice is build those networks of support, ideally within your school. They could be informal networks at first, hopefully across schools, where you can be in conversations with others that remind you that you're not crazy in believing that a much better school is possible. That a school that actually celebrates leadership coming from everywhere is possible, where you see that and where you become that force. I'm sure you've heard the story of the little child that is walking by the sea, by the ocean, and sees all these little crabs, right? That as the sea has receded, they're going to die because they're not in the water and they're not walking fast enough. And he begins to pick them up one at a time and to throw them back in the ocean, right? And along comes these men who looks at the kids and said, little child, what are you doing? What difference do you think you could possibly make throwing these crabs to the ocean? Do you see how many of them there are? And the little child looks at the man, looks at the crab, picks up the crab, throws it in the ocean and says, well, made a difference for that one. But I think the story shouldn't end there. I mean, the story is about the power of making a difference one crab at a time or once at a time. The story shouldn't end there. The story should have ended in saying, and in the beach, looking at that child, were 1,000 other kids who were inspired by what he did and who then joined him. And together, they brought all the crabs back to the sea. And I think that's the power that you have. Your actions in producing change in whatever space you have are going to have a ripple effect. Are going to have a ripple effect. They're going to inspire others. You will see you're not alone. And others will say, if she had the courage to do this, why couldn't I that? And I think that's how you move a system. That's how change happens in society. So that's all I've got to say.
Thank you so much, guys. And so let me just wrap up before we finish. I think you may remember that earlier today, when we watched episode 8, Andres Sliker from the OECD spoke about how we should be raising globally competent students who aren't just good at science, but will grow up to be great scientists who can solve the problems of the world. And Kiran Sethi then spoke about how our education systems can sometimes make students learn subjects isolatedly in different lessons, but she instead advocates design thinking projects where students have a problem to solve, and when they try to solve it, they seek to learn the math and the language and the science behind it to solve it. I believe that what we spoke about tonight, today at the Masterclass really culminates, brings all these things together, these ideas together. And this book and these lesson plans offer us a how-to, a way in which this comes together practically. And not only does it have a change management strategy for schools, it's also an example of how the curriculum can be designed with example lesson plans for teachers that sets the SDGs as the goal, as the real problems that we need to solve and that we need to bring to the forefront as the lesson objectives, whatever subjects we are teaching. And then engage the students to understand the different aspects of these SDGs further through a series of internet connected lessons for different subjects. And it's no longer siloed. It doesn't have to be siloed to just doing it all in all my math lessons, but lesson 1 could be an art lesson and collaborating with lesson 2 as a science teacher, and the third lesson, a math lesson. There's so much we can do with this. We can contextualize to our own context. And I really hope that the book that is now available in English for all of you, and the links are there for you to download and get, but also the Malay version that we're about to release soon will be really a resource that you can use. And as Professor Fernando Reimers said, build upon, take the first 60 lessons are just to inspire you as a prototype to help you see if you can actually make it work in your own context. But what more can we do when we take that and we think about it? And if each one of us here took about what can come out of what's happened and what we've shared tonight. So yeah, the Malay version will be available for you shortly. Follow us on our social media at Leaps of Knowledge, and you will be updated. And if you've enjoyed today, remember that today is the first of a series of 5 events, and the next event will be on the 22nd of May. So we look forward to seeing you at episode E. Enjoy what you do and who you do it with. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Have a good evening for those in the East, and for those dialing in from the West, have a lovely rest of the day. See you soon. And thank you again to Professor Fernando Reimers and all our panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. And thank you, Lou, for your great leadership. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. I've got to go.